She walked into that ballroom 3 years later, not broken, not begging, but owning the entire event that the man who destroyed her had been invited to attend. And when their eyes met across that room, Gu Jun Kang, the man they called the King of Seoul, felt something he had never felt in his entire life. Fear, not of an enemy, not of a rival, but of the woman he threw away. 3 years before anyone in Seoul whispered her name with admiration, Nadine Shark was sitting alone on a private jet, 30,000 feet above a city that had just spat her out. She wasn't crying because she was weak. She was crying because she was human, and because in her arms, wrapped in a soft cream blanket, was a sleeping newborn, tiny, warm, completely unaware that the world she had just been born into had already tried to swallow her mother whole. Nadine pressed her lips to the baby's forehead. Her hands were trembling. Her voice, when she finally spoke, was barely above a breath. "I'm sorry, my little angel. Mommy couldn't protect us." The infant stirred softly, just the smallest shift of her body, as if to say, "I'm here. We're still here." Outside the window, the lights of Seoul shimmered beneath the clouds, beautiful and indifferent, growing smaller. Smaller. Gone. Nadine Shark had come to South Korea 5 years earlier as a young, ambitious black woman from America, full of vision, full of fire, the kind of woman who walked into a room and quietly recalibrated it without anyone realizing she had done it. She had built a small luxury brand from the ground up. She had plans, she had purpose, and then she met Gu Jun Kang, and for a little while, she thought she had found something even better than a dream. She had found a person. Jun Kang was 36 when they met, broad-shouldered, sharp-eyed, the kind of man whose silence commanded more attention than most men's loudest moments. He ran the most feared private empire in South Korea. Business tycoons respected him. Politicians obeyed him. Criminal organizations knew better than to speak his name in the wrong company. People called him the King of Seoul, but around Nadine, he was different. Quieter. Almost careful. She saw that version of him, and she believed it was the real one. That was her only mistake. They married within a year, and for a while a short, golden while things were good. Or at least Nadine believed they were. What she didn't know was that behind every smile, behind every dinner, and every private moment, Jun Kang's family was watching her the way powerful families watch things they intend to remove. To them, Nadine was an outsider. A foreigner. A woman who had no bloodline, no political connection, no approved history, and when Seo Hyrin appeared beautiful, calculated, and Korean in every way that mattered to the Kang family, everything that Nadine had carefully built inside that marriage began to be dismantled, quietly, systematically, brutally. Hyrin was not just beautiful. She was patient in the way that only truly dangerous people are patient. She had studied Jun Kang the way a surgeon studies an anatomy. She knew exactly where to press, exactly what to whisper, exactly when to cry. She told him Nadine had only ever wanted his money. She forged documents. She manufactured evidence, photographs, text messages, financial records, all of it designed to make a loyal woman look like a predator. And Jun Kang, a man who had survived wars on the streets of Seoul, who had outmaneuvered the sharpest minds in East Asian business, believed every single word. When Nadine fell pregnant, she thought it would change things. She thought the baby would remind him of what they were. Instead, it made him colder. He looked at her growing body and accused her of trying to trap him. The man who had once been careful around her was now looking at her like she was a problem to be solved. And Gu Jun Kang was very good at solving problems. The final blow came without warning. One morning, 2 immigration officers arrived at the residence. Nadine's residency status had been revoked. Her documents, they said, were under investigation. She knew it was a lie. She knew who had made the calls. She stood in the marble foyer of the home she had shared with her husband and looked at him across the hallway, her belly round, her eyes clear, her jaw set, and waited for him to say something. He said nothing. He turned away. Within days, Nadine Shark was escorted onto a flight back to America alone, pregnant, carrying nothing but a suitcase and the child of the man who had just erased her. Back in the Kang imperial estate, Seo Hyrin descended the grand staircase the morning after, barefoot, unhurried. running her fingertips along the walls of a home that did not belong to her as if she had already decided it did. Jun Kang stood at the window, looking out at Seoul's skyline. Hyrin came and wrapped her arms around him from behind. "Is it finally done?" He nodded. "She boarded the flight an hour ago." Hyrin smiled against his shoulder. "No more Nadine. No more Nadine." The words settled over the mansion like silk, and somewhere 30,000 feet above the city, a young black woman with tears on her face made a decision that no one in that mansion would ever see coming. She named the baby Ava. And the morning Ava opened her eyes for the first time in an American hospital, small, dark-lashed, perfect, something shifted inside Nadine that would never shift back. She stopped grieving, not because the pain was gone, but because grief was a luxury she could no longer afford. Life in America was not gentle. The woman who had once lived across 3 floors of a Seoul penthouse now worked 2 jobs in a city that did not know her name. She woke before dawn. She slept 4 hours when she was lucky. Some evenings she would count what was left in her purse after the groceries and the rent and the childcare, and she would move things around carefully, quietly, making sure that Ava had everything she needed before she allowed herself anything at all. She never complained, not once, because every single morning she looked into Ava's eyes, those dark, wide eyes that somehow already looked like they understood everything, and she remembered exactly why she had to survive. Then, on a rainy Tuesday evening in New York, fate made a move. Nadine was closing up her small cafe when she heard the sound of someone falling on the sidewalk outside. Dozens of people walked past. Umbrellas kept moving. Shoes clicked against wet pavement. Nobody stopped. Nadine stopped. She pushed through the door, knelt down in the rain beside an elderly man in an expensive coat, and stayed with him, her hand on his, her voice calm and steady until the ambulance came. The man's name was Han Sung-ho. He was one of the wealthiest businessmen in South Korea. And he had been invisible to every person on that street except for the woman too exhausted to walk past a stranger in pain. Sung-ho came back to the cafe weeks later, then again, and again. He would sit at the corner table, order the same cup of tea, and watch the way Nadine moved through the room, efficient, warm, precise, the way someone moves when they've learned that every second costs something. Eventually, he asked her story. She gave it to him plainly. No performance, no self-pity. Just the facts, clean and brutal, the love, the marriage, the betrayal, the deportation, the baby, the rain, the counting of coins. Sung-ho listened without interrupting. When she finished, he was quiet for a long time. Then he said, "You remind me of my daughter." Nadine looked at him carefully. "I've heard that before," she said. "No." He shook his head slowly. "I lost my daughter years ago. Helping you feels like God gave me another chance." Over the months that followed, Han Sung-ho became something Nadine had not expected to find in this chapter of her life. First a mentor, then an investor, then family. He did not give her a handout. He gave her a foundation and watched what she built on it. Within 3 years, the small cafe had become the seed of something extraordinary. Hotels, restaurants, real estate, technology investments. One magazine cover. Then another. Then another. By 32 years old, Nadine Shark, the woman Gu Jun Kang had deported with nothing, had become one of the wealthiest self-made women in the United States. Han Sung-ho had legally adopted her as his daughter and named her his heir. And not once, not one single time, had she reached out to Jun Kang. Meanwhile, in Seoul, the mansion that Seo Hyrin had so smoothly moved into was beginning to crack at the foundation. At first, everything seemed intact. The media celebrated the new relationship. Business continued, but quietly, steadily, things began to go wrong. One scandal. Then another. Investments that should have held collapsed. Partners who had been loyal for decades started making excuses and making distance. Hundreds of millions of dollars moved through accounts in directions Jun Kang's people could not track. And then one morning, Seo Hyrin was simply gone, along with everything she had quietly been moving for months. The betrayal landed differently from any he had ever known in business or in war. Because this time, he had let it in through the front door. He had held it at night. He had chosen it for the first time in his life. Gu Jun Kang sat in a room full of power and understood that he had made a catastrophic mistake. The wrong woman had left, and the right one, the one he had signed away with cold hands and cold eyes, was gone. He searched private investigators, international databases, corporate networks. Nothing. It was as if Nadine Shark had dissolved into the world and become something larger than what he could find. Then came the invitation, the Global Wealth Summit, hosted in Seoul. The most powerful names in business gathering in one room. Jun Kang accepted reluctantly. The event was held inside the Imperial Dragon Hotel, crystal chandeliers, polished floors, the murmur of influence in every corner. Politicians, royal family members, billionaires, celebrities, all of them filling a ballroom that hummed with the particular energy of people who had never had to doubt themselves. And then the room stopped, not gradually, all at once. Every conversation, every glass mid-raise, every laugh half-finished, silence. Every head turned toward the entrance. Jun Kang looked up from across the room and froze. She came through the golden doors the way a woman comes through a door when she knows exactly who she is and has nothing left to prove to anyone. Nadine Shark, 32 years old, dressed in an elegant black gown that fell against her deep brown skin like it had been made for no other purpose. Behind her walked security personnel, executives, investors, and beside her, a small hand tucked inside hers, a little girl. Jun Kang's heart stopped mid-beat. He didn't know her, but he recognized her. The shape of her eyes, the slight curve of her smile, the way she stood quiet and observant, missing nothing. Ava, his daughter, the child he had accused of being a trap. The child he had never once tried to find. For a long moment, Gu Jun Kang, a man who had never flinched at anything, could not move, could not speak, could not breathe. Nadine's eyes found his across that enormous, silent ballroom. And what Jun Kang saw in them was worse than hatred, worse than anger, worse than the cold fury he had half expected, half deserved. What he saw was something that no amount of power, no empire, no network, no influence could have prepared him for: calm. The deep, unshakable calm of a woman who had walked through fire and come out the other side no longer afraid of heat. Then Ava tugged her mother's sleeve. "Mommy." Nadine looked down at her daughter. The little girl pointed directly at Jun Kang. "Who's that man?" The room, if it was possible, became even more still. Jun Kang felt something move through his chest that he did not have a word for. 3 years of distance. 3 years of searching. 3 years of living with the particular weight of knowing exactly what you threw away. All of it compressed into one small question from a child who had never been told his name. Nadine looked at Ava for a long moment. Then she looked back at him. She knelt beside her daughter and whispered something softly into her ear. Ava's eyes went wide. Then the little girl looked up at Jun Kang, this powerful, terrified, motionless man, and smiled. A single tear broke free and ran down Jun Kang's face. He didn't wipe it. He didn't look away. And just as he took his first step forward, a voice moved through the ballroom like a stone dropped in still water. "Mr. Kang, I suggest you think very carefully before approaching my family." Everyone turned. Behind Nadine stood Han Sung-ho, the man they called the Lion of Wall Street, the man whose name moved markets, the man who had found a woman in the rain and recognized in her the thing most men in power never bother to look for. Someone worth believing in. Jun Kang looked at Sung-ho, then back at Nadine, then at Ava, and the full weight of what he had done, what he had signed away, walked away from, chosen to lose, settled on him all at once. The woman he had deported with nothing was now the adopted daughter and named heir of one of the most powerful men on earth. She had not just survived, she had transformed. And now she was standing inside the room he had been invited to because she owned the company that was hosting it. Nadine met his eyes one final time, not with revenge, not with the bitterness she had every right to carry, but with a challenge, quiet, steady, absolute, the kind of challenge that asks, "Who are you, really? And is that person worth the forgiveness you haven't even earned yet?" Gu Jun Kang understood something in that moment that no rival, no crisis, No business catastrophe had ever taught him. The most important battle of his life was not behind him. It was standing 10 feet away in a black gown, holding the hand of a little girl who had a smile, and it hadn't even started yet. Nobody warned Nadine that power could feel like a trap. She had spent 3 years building walls not out of fear, but out of discipline. Every brick laid with intention. Every boundary drawn with the quiet precision of a woman who had learned, the hard way, that softness without armor was simply an open wound. So when the knock came at the door of her hotel suite that night after the summit, after the ballroom, after the entire city of Seoul had watched Gu Jun Kang's composure shatter in real time, Nadine already knew who it was before she touched the handle. She stood still for a moment, her reflection stared back at her from the dark glass of the window still in the black gown, her earrings catching the low light. Her jaw set in that way it always set when she was deciding something important. Ava was asleep in the adjoining room. Sungho had gone to his own suite an hour ago, but not before looking at her with those quiet, knowing eyes and saying nothing. He never had to say much. She opened the door. Jun Kang stood in the hallway in a dark jacket, no tie, the top button of his shirt undone, and he looked like a man who had not slept in 3 years. Not disheveled. Men like Jun Kang never allowed themselves to look disheveled. But there was something underneath the surface of him that was fraying in real time, and it showed in his eyes the way a fault line shows not until the moment it gives. He didn't speak immediately. He just looked at her. The way you look at something you lost and found again, and you're not yet sure if finding it was grace or punishment. "I'm not here to ask for anything," he said finally. His voice was lower than she remembered, quieter. Stripped of the authority she had once found intoxicating and later understood as armor. I needed you to know that I know." Nadine leaned against the door frame and folded her arms. She looked at him the way she had looked at balance sheets and hostile boardrooms and every person who had ever underestimated her with complete, unhurried composure. "Know what, exactly?" she said. "What I did to you." He said it plainly. "No performance. What I allowed. What I chose." The hallway was silent except for the distant sound of the city below Seoul at midnight, still alive, still indifferent, the same city that had watched her disappear and was now watching her return without blinking. Nadine studied him for a moment. The slight tension in his jaw, the way his hands stayed still at his sides, deliberately still, the way powerful men hold themselves when they're trying not to reach for something. "You should go," she said. He didn't move. "Nadine." Her name in his mouth still did something to the air. She hated that. She noted it carefully. The way she noted everything, filed it, held it at arm's length, refused to let it move her before she was ready. "Jun Kang." She said his name back, clean and level. "I opened the door because I wanted to see what 3 years had made of you. And now I've seen it." She paused. "Good night." She began to close the door. His hand came up, not forceful, just present, and rested flat against the frame. Not pushing, not demanding, just there, like a question. The warmth of him radiated across the small space between them. He smelled the same. Something dark and expensive, like cedar and ambition, and every complicated night she had spent in that penthouse trying to believe she was safe. She looked at his hand, then at his face. "You don't get to come back the same night I reclaim everything," she said quietly. "That's not how this works."
"I know," he said.
"I know that." But he didn't move his hand. And she didn't close the door. The silence between them stretched taut, electric, impossible, the kind of silence that knows exactly what it contains and refuses to name it. She let him in. She would not pretend otherwise, and she would not explain it, not to Sungho, not to herself, not to the version of her that had counted coins at midnight so her daughter could eat. That woman deserved an explanation. But that woman also deserved this, the right to decide for herself what she did with the door she had earned the right to open. The suite was dim. A single lamp in the corner. The skyline of Seoul spread through the floor-to-ceiling windows like a painting that couldn't decide if it was beautiful or dangerous. Jun Kang stepped inside and stopped. He looked at the room, the files on the desk, the small pair of shoes by the couch, a child's drawing pinned to the side of the minibar with hotel stationery, and something in his face changed. Something shifted behind his eyes in a way that had nothing to do with power and everything to do with loss. He picked up the drawing at a woman and a small girl, rendered in the clumsy, gorgeous honesty of a 3-year-old's hand. Below them, in Ava's careful, oversized letters, "Me and Mommy." Jun Kang stood very still. Nadine watched him from across the room. She watched the way the drawing sat in his large hands, watched the way his chest expanded slowly, with a breath he seemed to need badly. "She's extraordinary," he said, without turning around. "She is," Nadine said. "She didn't get that from you." It landed the way she intended, not cruel, just honest. The truth of it quiet and clean like a blade laid flat on a table. Not a threat, just a fact. He turned to face her. The low light caught the angles of his face, the jaw she had once traced with her fingers, the eyes she had once believed she understood. He looked at her across the room, and the distance between them felt like something physical, like weather. "I've been looking for you for 2 years," he said. "I know." Something flickered in his expression. "You knew." "I have people too, Jun Kang." He absorbed that. She could see him recalibrating, adjusting to this version of her the way you adjust to a room you thought you knew that has been completely rearranged. "You chose not to be found," he said slowly. "I chose to be ready," she corrected. "There's a difference." He moved toward her, then not quickly, not with the imperious certainty that used to fill every room he entered. He moved the way a man moves when he is no longer sure of the ground beneath him and is still choosing to walk anyway. He stopped close enough that she would have had to reach out to touch him, and she didn't. He was looking at her the way he had looked at that drawing, with the particular grief of a man realizing that what he destroyed was irreplaceable. And underneath the grief, barely contained, was something else, something older. Something that had apparently survived every catastrophe between then and now. Nadine felt it too. She felt it in the way her breath slowed, in the way the room seemed to shrink quietly around the two of them, Seoul glittering beyond the glass, the city holding its breath alongside her. She lifted her chin. "Don't," she said softly. "Nadine," I said, "don't." Not sharp, not afraid, just clear. The way only women who have survived their own devastation can be clear. "Whatever this is, whatever you think you feel, I am not the woman you left. I am not someone you get to come back to because Hiren took everything and I happen to become someone worth returning to." He flinched. She watched it happen. "You think that's what this is," he said. "I think you don't know yet what this is," she replied. "And I think I've spent 3 years being certain. So no. Not tonight." The space between them held everything unsaid, and there was so much of it. 3 years of unsaid things, compressed into the warmth of a dimly lit room. 2 people standing on opposite sides of a history that had nearly destroyed one of them. Jun Kang looked at her for a long moment. Then he did something she did not expect. He stepped back, gave her the space she had claimed without asking him to. "All right," he said quietly.
And he meant it.
He crossed to the window and stood there instead, looking out at the city, hands clasped behind his back, just existing in the room without demanding anything from it. The way a man stands when he is trying to learn a different way to be. Nadine looked at his back for a moment, then she moved to the chair by the window, sat down, tucked her feet beneath her, and for the first time since the ballroom, maybe for the first time in 3 years, she exhaled completely. They didn't speak for a long time. Seoul shimmered below them, indifferent and alive, and between them, something ancient and dangerous and terrifyingly tender held itself very, very still. Morning came without mercy. Nadine was already awake when the city began to pale, sitting at the desk in the gray pre-dawn light, a cup of coffee gone cold beside her, her laptop open to a document she hadn't managed to read a single line of. Jun Kang had left some time before 3. He had not touched her. He had not asked again. He had simply sat with her in the quiet until the quiet became something bearable, and then he had stood, taken his jacket from the back of the chair, and looked at her one last time before walking to the door. At the threshold, he had paused. I know I don't have the right to ask for time, he said. Nadine had looked at him from across the room. No, she agreed. You don't. I'm going to ask anyway. She said nothing. He left. And now the morning was here, gray and unhurried, and Nadine sat with the cold coffee and the unsettling knowledge that she had not told him no. She heard Ava before she saw her, the small feet padding across the adjoining room, the door opening the way 3-year-olds open doors, with their whole body. Ava appeared in the doorway in her pajamas, hair sleep-wild, clutching the stuffed rabbit that went everywhere with her, and looked at her mother with those enormous dark eyes that saw everything. Mommy, you didn't sleep. I slept a little, Nadine said, which was almost true. Ava climbed into her lap without being invited because she never waited to be invited. She simply decided, and that was one of the 1,000 things Nadine loved about her. The small body settled against her chest, warm and solid and real. Is that man coming back? Ava asked. Nadine went very still. Which man, baby? The one who cried. Ava said it with the simple directness of a child who has not yet learned that some truths are better softened. At the party. He looked at us and cried. Nadine pressed her lips into her daughter's hair. She breathed in shampoo and sleep and something that was just purely Ava, the smell that had kept her standing on every night when standing was hard. I don't know yet, she said honestly. Ava considered this. He looked sad, the little girl said, but not mean sad, just lost sad. Nadine closed her eyes, out of the mouth of a 3-year-old, lost sad. As if all of Jun Kang's ruined empire, all of his miscalculations, all the wreckage of his choices could be distilled into exactly those 2 words and become something almost human. She thought about the way he had stepped back from her last night. She had expected him to push men like Jun Kang always pushed. They used their size, their authority, the sheer gravity of their presence as leverage, even when they didn't intend to. It was simply what they had been built to do. But he had stepped back. She didn't know what to do with that. Later that morning, a card arrived at the suite.
No envelope, no flerish.
A single line in Jun Kang's handwriting, dense, precise, the handwriting of a man who said very little in words and meant everything he wrote. I will not come back unless you ask me to. But I will not stop trying to deserve it. Nadine read it twice. She set it on the desk beside the cold coffee. She did not throw it away. Sung-ho arrived at 11, moving through the suite with the unhurried authority of a man who had built enough of his life on instinct to trust it completely. He poured himself tea, looked at the card on the desk, looked at Nadine, and said nothing for a long moment. Then, you let him in last night. It wasn't a question. I let him into the suite, Nadine said carefully. Not into anything else.
Seung nodded slowly.
He sat down across from her, his hands wrapped around the teacup, his old eyes reading her the way they always did, gently, thoroughly, without judgment. He is not the same man, Sung-ho said. People say that. People who have not watched a man lose everything he valued and survive it say that. He paused. I have watched him lose everything. And I have watched you rebuild everything. The question is not whether he has changed. He looked at her steadily. The question is whether the woman you have become is willing to let the story be more complicated than the wound. Nadine looked out the window. Seoul was awake now, traffic and light, and the relentless motion of a city that didn't pause for anyone's reckoning. She thought about Ava's word. Lost sad. She thought about a hallway and a hand against a door frame and the way a man's silence could say more than everything he had ever spoken. She thought about what it had cost her to become the woman sitting in this chair. And she thought carefully, dangerously, about whether that woman was strong enough now to hold something complicated without being broken by it. She didn't have an answer yet, but for the first time in 3 years, she was asking the question. And that, she understood, was already something.